Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. We hope this can be a time to focus in and remember the continued importance of art and of science. Today, we're talking with Brittany Ransom. She's an artist and educator currently living in Long Beach, California. In her work, she strives to probe the lines between human, animal, and environmental relations while exploring emergent technologies. She was a resident in our cross-disciplinary collaborative residency program, The Bridge. So thanks so much for being with us today, Brittany. We will also have a Q&A audience questions portion at the end of this talk. So if you have questions, you can type those in at any point through the Q&A box, and we'll be answering some at the end. Brittany, can you just start by giving us an overview of your work?
Yeah, I can. Thanks for having me. Thanks to those of you that are tuning in, especially during this difficult time that we're all experiencing. I really appreciate you being here. So I'm an artist, an educator, and someone working with digital fabrication technology tools to explore the notion of people and pests and our kind of inner working and overlaid kind of relationships. I think a lot about people and how our impact collectively obviously has impact on our shared environment. This is a picture of me from the Arctic Circle in 2014. And I've traveled all over the world and significantly all over the country exploring different pest systems, primarily insect-based pest systems, and thinking about how their systematic structure is somewhat parallel and metaphorical to our own. All of my work primarily draws from thinking about these natural-based systems and thinking about myself as a human within those systems and all of us collectively within those systems. I just finished being an artist in residence at LACI, which is the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, and I'm going to share a couple images from a project that I just finished and then contextualize it really quickly with a couple previous projects. But the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator is essentially a part of the Department of Water and Power, where there are essentially startup groups working to come up with clean energy solutions for the city of Los Angeles. And I was invited as an artist in residence to work in their advanced prototyping center, to work on a particular project exploring bark beetles and wildfires here in Southern California. There have been a few other artists looking at bark beetles and their effects on forests all across the United States, but here in particular in California, we had just experienced, when I started this residency, a particularly bad wildfire season. And these bark beetles are a pest that really thrive on kind of dry environments and can amass in large forest regions and essentially deplete the trees from the inside out, especially when we have a lack of rain. And I began getting really interested in the paths that these beetles make. Let me see if I can play this for you. It may or may not play. I use things that I carry around in my pocket as tools often. This is a 3D scan of a piece of bark. I'm going to pause it right here. And to give you an idea, you've probably, if you're someone that goes hiking or walking kind of anywhere that there are trees, you might notice these kind of patterns on wood. And underneath there is typically from a species of bark beetle. I look a lot at path making by insects. I think a lot about the societal structure of insects, things like termites, ants, in this case, beetles, things that we really think of as pests as humans, and looking at things that we're generally kind of interested in eradicating from our daily lives because they cause us a problem or a disruption in what we are used to. With these particular pests, I got really interested in looking at the paths that they make under the bark, and started thinking about the highway system here in Los Angeles, and kind of using these beetles as a metaphor for thinking about how we disrupt the natural landscape with our own kind of mark making and laying things like highways and neighborhoods, in the same way that these beetles go underneath the trees and make their own type of paths. So I started 3D scanning these and then started doing kind of experiments on visualizing these paths and making them related to our own. This was an installation that I did in downtown Long Beach. using some basic kind of anaglyph ideas where pedestrians could walk through and look through these small portholes that would basically take away the beetle paths and reveal the LA highway system, or vice versa, depending on the color. And again, to think about ourselves as kind of the largest pest-based system on the planet. I'm a little bit of a misanthrope. I think that we have a long way to go as people in terms of the way that we use the planet and think about how we essentially carve up the planet. And so this work was really kind of an exploration of thinking about the ways that our paths and pest paths maybe aren't so different. I spend a lot of time, that first scan that I showed you, I was using my cell phone to 3D scan pieces that I had found while hiking. During my time at Lacey, I was also working in partnership with the LA Arboretum, who let me collect specimens on their property and then use a bigger 3D scanner to scan these to create some larger installations. So this is just a little bit of my process. I work starting with the material itself from nature, then 3D scan it and digitize it. This is another piece of bark beetle wood. And then I recreate these as sculptural objects. Again, really thinking about how to take scale and shift something that's really, really small and make it relatable to our own bodies and our own kind of pest-based system that we operate in. So this is that same initial piece of bark that I showed in the very first scan as a small, about a 6.5 inch 3D print. I use tools like CNC machines to then carve these out. I'm using PLA plastic and then working with recycled materials that we get from a boat building company here in Long Beach to carve these out on a CNC machine. These things then come together as large scale prototypes and then ultimately installations that become sculpture. I teach sculpture at CSU Long Beach and work in a large scale sculptural format right now. And so these are enlargements essentially of those bark beetle paths. And again, I think a lot about the highway system here in looking at all of those paths. I do a lot of specimen collecting and thinking through work systematically. These are all 3D prints made from scans of different bark beetle damaged pieces that ultimately go into installations that begin to look like this. For me, thinking through these pest-based systems is also building an archive. For me, a lot of these pieces that I collect started to become like skeletal structures or like ghost remnants of the tree. I play a lot with light and electronics, and sometimes with small microcontroller robotics in my work as well. So this was an installation from the bark beetle pieces. These are 3D prints from a Form Labs printer, and using ultraviolet light to illuminate the paths and the material itself. Kind of scroll through these. In this series, the paths become almost non-visible, and these again become more like markers of the tree before it fell ill. I mentioned that I work a little bit with kinetics and electronics. As part of this same series, I was reconstructing small versions of cities using buildings from SimCity to create a robotic car. And then this robotic car traveled a map of Los Angeles. Let's see if this one will play. It may or may not. This little car traveled the Los Angeles highway system, and then these paths were placed underneath the beetle paths. This is kind of parallel metaphor proposition in the gallery. It's a really short video. It's only like 6 seconds. So I spend a lot of time kind of moving between this interplay of human-made paths and insect-made paths, and thinking about how those two pest-based systems are really similar. I also make some formal work too. This is the same series with the paths kind of abstracted from the actual bark itself, and thinking about how these begin to look like, for me, neighborhood subdivisions. If you're looking from Google Maps from the top and start looking at neighborhoods, thinking about the way that subdivisions and neighborhoods are built, with cul-de-sacs and streets that end. These are water jet cut, using a water jet cutter at Lacey. I've been really fortunate to have access to tools through municipal partnerships and through universities to be able to make a lot of this work. This is one of them. So these are laser or water jet cut steel. In previous work, so I've spent the last year working on this bark beetle project, and you know, a lot of people have asked me if there's an artist named David Dunn who's been working on bark beetle research for quite some time. I'm not necessarily working on a solution for bark beetles, though I have passed on my 3D scans to entomologists that allowed me to work, for example, at the LA Arboretum, or to other scientists that are like, looking at this has allowed me to think about these kind of trails in a different way, but not necessarily posing a solution. Though I do think about a solution for those kind of systems, or our system clashing with another system often. In previous works, though, I would say that I mostly am thinking more speculatively and trying to get us to understand ourselves as a pest structure, and thinking about different ways that we can change our systems to be less invasive, I guess, on the planet. In previous works, I've made things like really large ant farms. This was a piece that I did for Transmediale in Berlin in 2017, where I used ants and these vacuum formed chambers, essentially, that acted as continents to see if these ants would work together as a community and travel from one to the other, called primitive borders. And at the time, this was when we had border restrictions just being put in place and travel bans being put in place from other countries. So I think about, again, these human systems layered on top of these insect systems quite a bit. And again, I like to play with material a lot. This material is called ant gel. From my research, I found that it was originally developed for NASA to send ants into outer space for research. It's now become a really common material in the Uncle Milton ant farms that you now can buy at Target, and that you can make, you know, on your own. And so this idea of material play and future materials is something that's really interesting to me, and something that I work through in my practice a lot. A long time ago, I made a piece called Tweet Roach. This is from 2012, where, again, thinking systematically about something like the internet, Tweet Roach was a project that allowed Twitter to essentially control the movement of a cockroach during the 2012 election, when people would hashtag right or left. I had developed a system that would take the hashtags and then send them to the cockroach to drive it left or right in space. At the time, you know, normally my projects don't take a situation where an insect is, you know, roboticized. But I've done some writing about this piece and think about all of the different ways that insect bodies in particular are augmented with robotics for military use, but also for use in things like earthquake searching. They've started using cockroaches with cameras to develop systems for searching for earthquake victims in rubble. But thinking about how the internet extends beyond our own human bodies and can be applied to insect bodies is something that's interesting to me, and not only insect bodies, but other animal bodies. In this case, thinking through, you know, this is long before we kind of became Instagram obsessed and Facebook obsessed. But thinking through how utilizing or posting things like hashtags can have kind of abject effect without knowing it. In this case, it was really interesting. After about 30 minutes, each cockroach in this installation learned to ignore the internet, or knew that these were false signals coming to its body. And this system that's on this cockroach, I should mention, isn't one that I fully developed on my own. It was a system that was being sold by a group called Backyard Brains, who make kits for students to be able to study neuroscience. I purchased one and then essentially hacked it to use it for this purpose. And so it's interesting also to think about how there's a quote from a book called Frankenstein's Cat, And I don't have the exact quote pulled up, but it's asking, you know, with little time and not needing much resources, it's you know, interesting to think about how we all can create our own at-home cyborg, and what does that mean for our own responsibility as people. And also thinking about that, what that means in terms of the responsibility of kind of the interconnectedness of the internet, and applying that onto other systems that are non-human. So this was a project that I had worked on a while ago. I think a lot about, let's see if this plays, insect systems a lot related to cities. This is a video, if it does play, that is a grouping of termites that I had put on a really quick ink drawing of the DFW highway system. I was living in Dallas at the time. And I had projected this onto the buildings downtown as part of a festival, a digital festival that happens in Dallas called Aurora. And again, I knew about this because I had done an experiment that was like a Carolina biological supply experiment that explored pheromones and pheromone structures, and how ants and termites will follow the smell of Bic pen as a following mechanism, or as a mimic mechanism for pheromones that they use to follow one another. And so I used this to have the insects travel the DFW highway system while being projected in the middle of Dallas. Thinking about this, it's like in this system, see if I can get back to a wider view. I think about them traveling in the same way that we travel. There's car accidents, there's some people going rogue, or insects going rogue off of the highway. There's some following the rules, there are some that are not. But again, thinking really metaphorically about insects as a kind of driver for thinking about the way that we move and occupy space as people and as a system. I've been thinking about pests for quite a while. This is from 2011. It's a kind of table platform that I had made as part of my thesis exhibition in grad school, where I was looking at using termites as a possible energy partner. In reading different studies from the government, termites can produce hydrogen and methane gases. And so I was interested in seeing if I could feed termites my paper waste, while at the same time allowing you to kind of dine at their table. This was a piece that allowed people to walk on it and sit on it. It was a piece that used transduction speakers that turned the actual platform into the speaker itself, where you could listen to the termites eating my paper waste. So I was turning my paper waste into little structures for them to consume. Anything from pizza boxes to bills. At one point I had fed them my birth certificate to see how much hydrogen gas it produced. And so I have this kind of fantasy of also thinking about these pest-based systems as possible partners, and ways that we can look at them and think through how we might be able to change some of our systems. My kind of dream, and I told someone this at Lacey recently, is to be able to have this kind of, I have this fictionalized version of a car where I put my paper waste in and the termites eat it. And like, I'm able to propel myself from X, Y to Z in my daily travel, using them as kind of a driver. And so I think about those systems a lot. The more I work, the more I realize I'm interested in looking at the juxtaposition between these pest-based systems and thinking about our own system in cities. I've lived in pretty major cities for the last 10 years. I had done this as part of a project with some of my fellow grad students at UIC in 2011, where we were able to use the Hyde Park Art Center projection gallery. And I'm from a farm town. I was thinking about these beetles that eat crops in farm towns, called the bean beetle. And they essentially eat these beans and lay an egg, and they keep doing that until there's no bean left. And I did this projection across, there's like a residential area of apartments across the way, and thinking about apartments as kind of this like cyclical space that we kind of use to build families and communities, but also thinking about this bean as the same kind of container for a place of of this type of system building its own community and family structure. So these were eating and hatching and kind of using these beans as a host in the same way that I thought of our own neighborhood systems. I make a lot of backpacks for things. I don't have time to show them all. This was a series that I had done where I was tracking best beetles in the nighttime using long exposure photographs. And again, at the time I had bought a Garmin. This was pre having a phone that could make a map for you of where you walk. But I wanted to see if my mark making or my walking through, at the time, Chicago was similar to these beetles. So I would spend hours at nighttime doing long exposure photographs of their trails. So a lot of mark making and path following from insect kind of perspective, and thinking about how our path making and mark making and systematic structure is really very pest-like and similar to a lot of pests that we're interested in kind of eradicating. I'll wrap this up relatively quickly. Some things that I do outside of my own practice that I think are relevant and interesting and really drive my practice. I've worked with SIGGRAPH for the last 4 years. I'm taking a break this year as the art gallery chair, and I've also done the studio chair. So bringing some of these technologies to a hands-on platform, making things like a giant maker space for the 16,000 attendees that come to SIGGRAPH. And the SIGGRAPH Art Gallery has been around for a really long time, and being a part of that lineage and curating art, tech, and science-based specific shows. I was really fortunate that last year around this time, I was working with American Arts Incubator and 01, another art and technology group that's been around for a long time. And I was partnered with a city in Mexico, teaching digital fabrication technologies for new uses in that community. And I write a lot. I've been fortunate to be asked to contribute some of these thoughts to different texts. Obviously, the SIGGRAPH special issue with Leonardo, the 3D Atavist Cookbook, which is organized by Morris Shinalahari and Daniel Rourke, and the companion of Biology and Art and Architecture, with some other SciArt individuals. I know Carissa was a part of this group as well at some point. So I spend a lot of time, again, thinking through these ideas and writing. I find that to be a really critical part of my practice too. These are my dogs. I didn't have time, but I make dog toys, interactive dog toys, and have a whole subset of other projects that involve dogs. So with that, I'll open it up to Carrie for questions.
Great. Thank you so much. Really fascinating to hear about the different forms your art has taken.
I'm going to go back to an image that's not my dog's, just leave it here.
Yeah, and especially with this sort of collaboration between you as a human and the pest world and the parallels that are there. I was wondering how you became interested in this. How did that first start for you?
Yeah, I mean, I have always been interested in insects and animals. You know, as a kid, I had an insect container that I hid in my closet that my parents discovered later. So like my interest in insects has been like pretty long standing, but I'll say that I think I really began to understand that that working through some of these ideas in an art practice form was possible when I went to Ohio State. I had 2 really great professors and was part of the art and technology program there. And I was fortunate in the program allowed us access to spaces like the entomology lab that would let me take home insects for study or access that space for study. But I've definitely been deeply interested in insects and insect structures for a really long time. But I really think that being part of that program and having mentorship and access has been really important. I've continued to be part of primarily like public school institutions since. And I think the reason I kind of seek that out is access to scientists. I'm not trained in the sciences, but through collaboration and access to scientists as collaborators and researchers, I think I've really been fortunate to be able to keep working through a lot of these ideas in different ways.
Yeah. Have you found that there are other artists or scientists who are exploring really similar things to what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been artists that have been looking at or utilizing kind of art and tech and science-based practices for like the last 25, 30 years. Um, I've always been interested. One of my favorite artists is David Bowen, who's been using insect systems, primarily flies, for a long time in his work, giving them agency and doing things like writing Twitter messages. He has one called, I think it's called Fly Tweet,
Cool.
where the flies land on a keyboard and tweet things. But there's definitely a lot of artists, I think, working in this sphere. I think we all have our own kind of different takes on the conceptualizations that we're working towards in the end. But there are definitely, I think, a significant number of artists working through the idea of animal systems and human systems, and how those two things, you know, either collide, collaborate, or, you know, find opposition with one another, and how, you know, what can we do using art as a vehicle to explore those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, speaking of that, with your project with the termites in the table who eat the paper is such a cool idea. And I wonder if you have any other thoughts about ways there can be this sort of collaboration between the human and the insect world, and the
Yeah,
impact.
I mean, I think we really need to think about how to kind of dismantle the systems that we're comfortable with. I mean, I joke that a lot of people, the things that they want to eradicate from their house, I want them in my studio, but I don't necessarily want them eating my studio. And so thinking, you know, but that's kind of my human kind of, you know, comfort. In the same way, I'm sure that those systems don't want us in their spaces necessarily changing them either. But I think kind of a broad answer to that is that I think we need to think about the systems that we use in our own kind of daily lives, and think about how we can look to these natural systems and change those. I think, you know, biomimicry is a strong field, and I think we all should be on every level kind of thinking that way, of mimicking natural systems or working in collaboration with them to kind of change the way that we exist.
Yeah. And has your work changed any of your everyday practices outside of the art world or science world?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one thing that I will say that I think about a lot, and looking at this image, is my use of plastic. You know, I
Mhm.
work in digital fabrication. It's heavily plastic based. I'm really interested in artists who are looking at alternatives to this type of material, but particularly artists and scientists that are looking at alternatives to this type of material that aren't plastic based, or produce materials like agar-based plastics, or, you know, bioplastics.
Mhm.
And so it definitely, you know, as I worked through a lot of these technologies in the beginning, I'm becoming more and more sensitive to material use and where my materials come from. Because I don't want necessarily the materials and the idea of the work to be in conflict, but I also am really starting to recognize how these materials also pose some of the same problematic systems that I
Right.
want to talk about. So it's definitely something that's, you know, been changing my mentality about my work, and also these types of processes and tools.
Right. Yeah, I think that's sort of an emerging thing of there's a lot of art now about climate and environmental change, but the
Mhm.
materials that it uses are not necessarily um, with that message.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I know you mentioned you have dogs,
Ah,
and I was
yeah,
wondering how your relationship with your own dogs is, and if you sort of study that or are inspired
yeah,
by it in any way.
yeah, yeah. Well, especially now that we've been in a quarantine for almost 3 months, I feel like I've spent more time with them than I probably ever would have. Not that I don't see them, but like every day, all day. Yeah, a subset of my work that I didn't really talk about was thinking about kind of the perspective of other animals. I had built a system when I was finishing my undergrad, like pre-GoPro, that was outfitting dogs with a little vest and a spy camera to kind of see what they did when I wasn't home.
Oh, wow.
And really this started out of a relationship that I had with a rescue dog that I had gotten in Columbus, who when I would leave for class would rip up my garbage and my roommate's things. And I really wanted to kind of deconstruct this idea of like when my ideas of what the rules were in our domestic relationship changed when I would leave the house.
Mm-hmm.
Because clearly she had a moment when it was like fine that the rules I had set up were not what she was going to follow. And so I've spent a lot of time through that system. I used that like vest recording system for almost 6 years on different dogs that people would allow me to put the vest on and record their kind of daily activities for weeks at a time. And I do think about the way that I interact with them and spend time with them and like think about what their needs are and when our kind of relationship breaks down. And again, in this kind of like idea of like domestic partnership in our house. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but I do spend a significant amount of time thinking about that. I had worked at this place called Workshop Residence on developing a system of toys that was, you know, the idea was to allow dogs to communicate with humans by using tactility. I know we all have this dream of like, if I could only hear what my dog has to say. The idea of these, and I still work on them, but I'm at a material impasse actually, where I'm trying to find a safe material for these to be made in. But if, you know, dogs pick up things through texture, through their mouths, and the idea of these toys was that they could squeeze on different facets of them and learn to say things like, I want to go here. I want this toy. I'm hungry. By learning different textures. I didn't show them in this today because I focus mostly on insects, but I am interested in kind of thinking about decoding those relationships and thinking about, you know, what that means to live together. I live with 3 other dogs, and yeah, thinking about how we communicate with one another is something I think about every day.
Yeah. I was wondering if you could tell us more about your project with the small backpacks on the insects, which was that what created or illuminated what became that path that you showed?
Yeah, so these are a type of beetle, and I didn't go in depth on a lot of these things. These best beetles are a beetle that are actually sold by Carolina Biological Supply. You can also find them obviously out in the natural world. And the reason I got interested in these is that there's a thing called the penny pole experiment, where you essentially study the strength of the exoskeleton of this insect, or its like bodily strength, because its exoskeleton's on its outside. And you attach a petri dish and fill it with pennies and see whose beetle can pull more pennies. It's interesting with this project, I thought about tracking these things in a way that allowed me to put something that was detachable, or that they could even detach themselves on their bodies. And so this is just a really tiny piece of detachable Velcro, a watch battery, and an LED, so relatively light. I don't have a video in this presentation, but there's one on my website of these beetles moving around with these pads on. And then I would go into places where I could find these naturally and put these backpacks on, and then would do long exposure images of them moving around the places that I would find them. It was really interesting. The beetles were, I don't know why I'm always continually surprised, but they were smart enough to rub their bodies against the wood and then would detach the backpacks themselves. And that's when I generally would end the image. And so I have a whole series of these images in different locations with these beetles moving around. And at the time, I again was just getting interested in this idea of tracking my own movement. I had bought like a Garmin camping watch that could map out your pattern at the time of where you would go. And I wanted to see if they essentially had similar paths. Like if I pulled this beetle off of this piece of wood, or out of this piece of wood, if they had similar kind of travel patterns from one day to the other in the same way that I did within a city.
Did you find that they did?
This one was a really hard one, and I'd love to admit when my kind of grand ideas, like the insect forces me to kind of rethink it. It was really difficult to like do this in like a same study situation of like, is this the same beetle? Is it doing, because I would essentially release these things right back. A lot of times I use insects that I get through Carolina Biological Supply. It's a whole other subset of a conversation of thinking about being able to purchase like insect bodies online is strange to me. These though were coming from the places that I was taking the images. And so in this case, I wasn't necessarily sure if I would have the same beetle, if, you know, so no, it ended up not being able to really show similarities between my path and theirs, but really just became this kind of mechanism for thinking about how they move across space in ways that we can't always see.
Yeah. Great. And looking forward, do you have any ideas or things you have not yet explored or want to build on more in your practice?
Yeah, so thinking about these ideas of sustainability and material research, right before we all kind of went on our global quarantine, I was still working at Lacey. And so my next plan was to go back to that partnered We Are All Pests project. There was a scientist that was willing to start helping me work on controlled studies for looking at the actual gas emission of termites and thinking through that. So I'm hoping that maybe once we get back to that space and are able to do those kind of experiments again, that might be something that I'm interested in returning to. Digital fabrication space is something that I've been exploring a lot more. And earlier projects, it was more about photography and using projection. I've definitely shifted my practice materially in also my teaching. I teach digital fabrication at CSU Long Beach here. And so those type of technologies are something that I'm becoming more interested in my own practice. But again, I think thinking about sustainable ways that those technologies are possible is the kind of next step in what I'm thinking of materially.
Great. Thank you so much. So now we're going to move on. Julia will hop in for some questions from the audience.
Okay.
Hey everyone, my name's Julia Hoel and I'm the director of SciArt, and we're going to voice some of the questions on behalf of the audience. So if you haven't submitted your question yet, please do so through the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. One of the questions, in which is kind of multi-part, is do you consider your work with insects to be cross-species collaboration? And, you know, relatedly or separately, what are the ethics that you consider or employ when working with other species?
That's a really good question. I like to think of this phrase from another favorite artist of mine, Nina Kachadorian, who describes some of her work as uninvited collaborations. And I think about my work sometimes in that context. I will say, ethically, I've gone through, I cannot begin to tell you how many animal ethics trainings as someone who works at universities. One thing that's really fascinating is that insects are not generally something that's covered because they're invertebrates. However, I will say that in thinking through these systems, one thing is that I generally don't necessarily pluck these things from the environment in which they exist. Like I just started to mention, the idea of the internet as this space that you can purchase other systems is interesting, problematic, and strange all at the same time to me. I primarily work with biological suppliers that generally sell these things to science labs for studies and experimentation. In terms of my own ethics with these things, I try and build systems that provide these insects with what they need And as soon as the installations are over, they live in my studio for the rest of their lives. That the cockroach in particular lived in a pretty lush habitat. But that is a question that comes up in my work a lot. And I also think about the same kind of inverse of that, in that as a society, we spend, millions of dollars a year eradicating these things from our food chain systems, from our homes. I often ask people, are you the squisher, the swatter, or the person that comes and gets the cup and helps the insect out of your house? But ethics are definitely something I think about in my work quite a bit, and I try to think about setting up ethical situations for these insects as I use them. I also, in my more recent work, again, some of these are 9-10 years old now. In the pieces with the bark beetle, for example, I've kind of shifted my practice into exploring things that insects do naturally without containing them anymore, because that is something that I think about. So in the bark beetle series in particular, it's more about data capturing after the fact, rather than kind of holding these things captive as part of an installation. So, and I will continue working that way, I think, in the future, rather than building these containment structures, thinking about methods of data capture and metaphor that don't necessarily require them being a central part of the installations themselves.
That sounds fantastic. And it's a great segue to another question we had in about, what have you learned from insects, whether they're in, more man-made habitats or in the natural habitats that you've worked with them in? Have you learned anything that us humans could benefit from?
I think that what's amazing to me about insects is just like how powerful they are in mass. You find something like a termite mound out while you're hiking, or, a giant anthill structure. And it's really interesting to think through how these insects for, thousands of years have survived these different changing climates. I don't have anything like specific that I've necessarily learned, other than, oftentimes I'm amazed at how they outsmart some of these, like especially in earlier works, how they almost outsmart these systems, particularly in tweet roach, in putting that backpack on that cockroach for months and trying these different systems. It was pretty amazing to see that it was able to ignore these kind of false signals that it was getting from the internet. We as people certainly can't do that. We're proving that every day, that we're not able to kind of leave the internet behind, or kind of leave signals that we get from the internet behind, or kind of sift through what's real and what's not. And so in particular, like the tweet roach project, cockroaches as a thing that would get exhausted by being constantly pinged by Twitter, and kind of ignoring it after a while, was something that was really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I loved that detail. That really, I think that is a lovely detail, kind of happy accident. And it's it gives us some hope, right? That if a cockroach can do that, then yeah. Speaking about your work with the dog toys, somebody out there is wondering if you have ever worked with an animal communicator, or if that's something, you would want to do within that line of work.
Yeah, not yet, but I would absolutely love to do it. I would also love to develop those the other kind of subset of that is as a training tool for dogs that act as service dogs, thinking about making objects that allow them to communicate in different ways is something that I fantasize about a lot. But I haven't had the opportunity to do that yet, but would love to. That's something I'd really love to do.
So if there are any animal communicators out there, email Brittany.
Get in touch with me.
Let me see here. We have a few more questions. Have you ever experienced resistance from colleagues, critics, or the general audience to your use of digital fabrication in your art making? Is there a perception that computer-controlled techniques are somehow illegitimate?
Yeah. Not in I would say not in any kind of like aggressive way, but I do think that there's a misconception about using digital fabrication tools, that they somehow make making objects easier, or making systems or structures easier. I think to a certain extent they do. I mean, we've definitely seen how 3D printing technologies can change something, quickly, like the medical supply. Like we just watched a lot of 3D printing kind of rapidly produce face shields and things. And so I do think that there is a certain advantage to using tools like that. But I think in an art context, a lot of times we're using these tools or almost misusing these tools in ways they were never meant to be used. In terms of, 3D scanning objects that are really complicated, and then wanting to replicate them out at a larger scale. There's a lot of systematic steps in using digital fabrication tools that I think are kind of glossed over. People assume that the computer's doing the work for you, when really you're using the computer in tandem. So, I think not like any kind of like overt, anger at like using these things or a misunderstanding of how easy they are. But I think more than anything, once someone wants to actually like utilize, like I teach, they're like, well, it's just easy. You just 3D scan it and then it comes out, like the thing just comes out. It's not quite that simple. And I think that it's maybe sometimes more of a misunderstanding than anything else. I think just like any other art material or research material, it's systematic. And so it's just a different system, a different mechanism for working through producing something.
Great, thank you so much. Well, that's all the time we have for questions for today. Brittany, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. It's nice to touch base with you again after you were in a residency program. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. If you missed part of the talk, it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel a little bit later on, so you can find it there as well as all the other lunch breaks that we've recorded. We hope to see you next week on June 10th for our lunch break with Pat Patarenudaporn, and you can stay up to date on this series as well as other activities by joining our mailing list at SciArtInitiative.org. We have a couple open calls coming up for an exhibition in our residency program, so for anyone who's interested out there, you'll be seeing an email from us shortly. So yeah, thanks again, Brittany, and hope to see you in Los Angeles sometime soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone for tuning in.